All right, hello. Welcome everyone to week 2 of the soundtrack. And hopefully everyone has watched Scott Pilgrim via Netflix. If you have not, do it. This will make more sense if you've already seen the film, but if you haven't seen the film, I guess you can watch the lecture. But yes, Scott Pilgrim is available on Netflix only until the 15th. So it's a good thing that I'm getting this out of the way week 1. And there's several reasons why I'm using this film for our first major discussion on the soundtrack and not a bunch of not random clips, but clips from a variety of different sources. And that's because it does utilize many of the basic concepts and terms of the soundtrack and sound design. So I definitely wanted to have a film that was very rich in its sound design, uh, and so you can parse it out in terms of dialogue and speech, in terms of sound effects, and also in terms of music. And these are all elements that are used. And then there's also the manipulation of the sounds. So there is the use of actual distortion, and then there is the slowing down sometimes of sounds. There's sometimes the speeding up of sounds. There's the use of echo. There's the use of reverb. A wide variety of different things that are utilized in this film in order to give us this world that is Scott Pilgrim versus the world. Also, if you haven't done so already, you've got chapters 1, 2, 3, and they're not that long, of hearing the movies. And I'm going to go over some of this in my lecture on Scott Pilgrim, but I'm not going to be like, so at chapter 1, this is, chapter 1 is speech. It pretty much is the three basic elements: speech, sound effects, and music. But there's a little more to that. And then you also have chapter 1 in this one. And this one is fascinating in the fact that Liz Green, who wrote the essay and one of the editors of the book, is discussing. She's very interested in sound design, sound designers, and noise, and how that relates to sound effects, but also to music, and trying to have a better definition of the three elements of sound to incorporate noise, and how noise is and how sound effects and music doesn't have to be pretty or doesn't have to be appealing. These are things that can be ugly, jarring, uh, not so great. So those are the things that I want you to read. And then you have your syllabus quiz that I called it survey quiz, but syllabus quiz is due by the end of this week, so that would be September 12th. And you also have your first weekly discussion journal, which is also due the end of day on the 12th. Now, your WDJs, just to give you an idea, are going to be found in the discussion board section of Blackboard. So I'm going to just click on it, and you are going to see right here, for WDJ number 1, you're going to see my instructions, but I want you to click on it, and I want you to then click on create a thread. So when you click on the title and you click on the create a thread, it will not only give you the instructions. So for this weekly discussion journal, you'll be writing about the sound design of Scott Pilgrim. Fancy that. And then your thread, you're going to have a subject line, and then you're going to write your response. So, so basically this instructions should be pretty self-explanatory, but I'll be boring right now and just say, you'll be writing about the sound design of Scott Pilgrim versus the World, directed by Edgar Wright, 2010. This film is very playful and has a very playful and complex sound design. The narrative and humor in the film is intensified by the use of sound effects, music, and how dialogue is used. This is based on the graphic novel by Brian Lee O'Malley, which heavily features witty pop culture fueled dialogue, the importance of music and songs, plus video game and comic book logic. These elements are featured heavily within the film, while the graphic novel only has visuals to rely on. Wright's Scott Pilgrim adds great oral elements to the film. The basics of the soundtrack is speech, sound effects, and music. I want you to talk about each of these elements and examples of these elements within the film. Please discuss the sonic elements that stand out to you. And now, through the clips that I'm going to be showing and through my discussion, I will have given you some examples of Edgar Wright's authorial sonic design, highlighting how his films have sonically intensified continuity. Okay, well, he does, but his sound design really leads his editing, and so the sound design is very much pushed to the forefront in Edgar Wright's work. So the audiovisual relationship featuring aggressive impact and intricate detail. And feel free to discuss how Edgar Wright uses dynamic contrast, non-diegetic sound effects, sonic transitional devices, and self-conscious narration. WDJs should be more than one paragraph in length, and you basically want to answer these questions the best that you can. So again, if you want to cut and paste into the thread body or the message, that's fine. You could write it elsewhere, but no attachments. This needs to be something that is visual within the discussion journal. All right, so there are the WDJs. All right, so your content besides this is our additional clips that will help you get through week 2 and in our discussion on Scott Pilgrim and the basic elements. So as I mentioned, the 3 basic elements of the soundtrack is speech, music, and sound effects. And speech is more than just dialogue. This can also be voiceover, and this film definitely features that as well. And also, when we think about how speech, music, and sound effects are used, not only in this film, but also in other films, there are different elements that we want to also think about and look at. So what is the musicality of the soundtrack? And this doesn't necessarily have to be just music. This can be the musicality of how the dialogue is delivered or how the sound effects are used. Musicality is not just reserved for sound, for music only. So if, I might, the rhythm of and the pace of the dialogue delivered could have a sense of musicality to it. So, I might be sing-songy as I'm saying, I love you, I love you, I love you. Okay, well, that was kind of singy, but still, I know, and I'm using, this phrase, I love you, which is something that is unique to speech in the fact that Certain words and certain phrases also have different meanings depending on how they're used, the context and how they're used, how they're stated, who's it directed towards, and a lot of different things. So you'll see, uh, uh, you'll notice uh, how when knives, uh, though it's in one of the video essays. I don't have that clip precisely. When Scott finally breaks up with poor Knives, oh, it's right after she says, because she's in love. And we see the word, and Scott just, wipes it away. And how she says it reflects her feelings for Scott. Now, yes, it's youthful, first love type of thing, but Scott, in turn, is having a hard time saying love, and he mistakenly, when he declares his love for Ramona, he says lesbians. And in the context of the film, we know that earlier Wallace, said, if you want to get this girl, you're going to have to break out the L word. And of course, he said lesbians. He's like, no, the other one, love. So context and how they're used by characters, how it's delivered, these are all important when you are watching a film. Saying "I love you" can have many different meanings, but also again how it's said. So the musicality of the soundtrack is extremely important, and so this is when we start thinking about the tempo. This is when we start thinking about the rhythm, and so when we start looking at, basically the tempo is the rate or the BPMs, the beats per minute, the pulse of the sound, the pace of the musical events. These are all things that the tempo is important. Overall, the pace of Scott Pilgrim is fast paced, and even certain scenes have its own, temporal, you know, it has its own tempo, it has its own rhythm. Rhythm is one step further where it's a little bit more complex. It's usually a distinctive grouping of notes rather than regular groups of meter. Typically we think of rhythm, you can associate that with like dance steps. So, the cha-cha and the tango, those have specific rhythms to them. And vocal rhythms can be a part of this too. When we're also thinking about sounds, it's also the volume. And as you're watching these, you'll notice that there's different levels of the volume, different levels of loudness. Some things are soft, especially when poor Knives is hurt in the film. She still reacts, but sometimes it's much more quiet, and then at other times she is loud. So she has a very dynamic range in her character, in the fact that she can be very quiet and she can be very loud. Same thing with Kim. Her character a lot of times is in the background behind her drum kit or in the background of a party judging, but when she's on stage, she can be very loud when she screams, "We are sex babam." So this, a lot of times we perceive loudness, sometimes with strength, sometimes we portray loud, depending on the loudness, as weakness. And in the case of some Edgar Wright, we can also use loudness as a way to connote certain characters and even how certain characters interrupt other characters within the film. Now, the timbre is the distinct sounds typically associated with musical instruments, but you can also think about this in terms of certain sound design. And the example that your book gives is this whole concept of when you hit a baseball, if you hit it with an aluminum bat and you hit it with a wooden bat is going to give you more of a clunk sound, and the aluminum bat is going to give you more of a or a tinny sound. So the crack of the bat is going to have two completely different distinctive sounds. And so these are all things that when we also start to think about sound and sound design, it's important to know not only the different sounds of musical instruments, but also the different sounds of locations. Locations have a distinctive sound to them. And these sounds can be manipulated through filters, through distortion, and through various other types of sound manipulation devices, reverb, and the like. And this also, again, you want to start to think about how sound is, or how sound is supposed to, how the soundtrack is supposed to sound like. When you also think about, say, listening to a piece of music that you're very familiar with. So let me just try to think of a song that everybody would know. Let's do I was gonna go do "Let's Go Crazy" by Prince. I would hope everyone knows that, but if you are listening to "Let's Go Crazy" or "When Doves Cry," how about let's do "When Doves Cry"? I feel like I should have more of a party anthem. Let's go 1999. Okay, so 1999 Prince. If you listen to the song 1999 in your car, it's going to sound a lot different than it does if you listen to it, say, on vinyl, coming out of, say, a tube amp and analog. Well, all speakers are analog, but analog speakers. Watching the video on your TV of 1999 and watching it through the sound bar, it's going to sound different than in your car through listening it on vinyl. Listening it to your cell phone is also going to have different sonic qualities. These are all things that the sound is transformed by how it's emanating out into the world. But sound designers also, when we have characters listening, they also are utilizing these tools, so that if a character is listening to a vinyl record, we might see them putting the needle on the record, but we will hear maybe the beginning of the little needle scratches as it first hits the groove. There might be some popping because it might be older and there's some dirt on it. There's distinctive little sounds that they're going to add to make it sound like, yes, we are listening to a vinyl record. It's also important to be familiar with pitch when we're dealing with high and low frequencies. High frequencies are traditionally your treble, and your low frequencies are typically your bass. And then we have thinking about texture. When we think about texture, this is where we start to think of the liveness of sound. When we start to think about the density, forward and background, what sounds can you hear? And so when we start to have things that your book describes, monophony, homophony, and polyphony. And a good sound designer will try to achieve some sort of polyphony in their sound design, because there's going to be elements in the foreground, midground, and background. But there will be competition on what is the loudest or what is more in the forefront. See, forefront. And then there's also the use of melody and that sort of thing. So we start to get a various hierarchy of sounds and what you can hear. Now, I discussed this a little bit on the first day, but when we start thinking about sound and space and sound and time, one of the biggest things is diegetic and non-diegetic. Non-diegetic is outside of the cinematic world or the television world or the video game world. Characters within that world can hear things that are diegetic. So sounds that are within. Same thing, there's certain things like typically when we think of the credit sequence and when the credits are over the image, this is traditionally seen as non-diegetic. The characters do not realize this is going on. But diegetic are things that the characters experience within the film. They hear Scott Pilgrim and Sex Bob-omb play, at Battle of the Bands. They hear Clash at Demon Head. They hear Crash and the Boys. They hear these performances. So these are all things that we have. And later on, we've got a song in a car. Gideon Grave is playing the Rolling Stones' Under My Thumb when he's taking Ramona back with him. So these are all things that again play with when we think about sound. Do the characters experience this or not within the film? Typically, score is something that is used that characters do not hear. It's for us, the audience. Voiceover, same thing. Traditionally, voiceover is something that is outside. Well, it depends on how the voiceover is used. Typically, it's outside of the diegetic world, especially when it's like an omniscient narrator, and they are filling in information that characters within the film do not want to share or do not want to reveal. Times that it is diegetic, so most voiceovers are non-diegetic, but sometimes when we have the characters expressing their thoughts, it is for us, the audience. The other characters can't hear it. The character that's hearing it within their head, it is part of the story. So it depends on the type of voiceover, and we'll get into that a lot more next week. Other fascinating things about sound and space, I guess, and when we think about location, there is on-screen and off-screen. So characters can hear it, but we might not see them saying things. There's also a fascinating thing called the acoustometre, which I love. It's a Michel Chion term, but basically it's an acoustical being for the most part. This is normally a sonic characteristic, a sonic character that is heard but not seen. And you can almost, at times think that very early on when Scott is talking about envy, or his ex-girlfriend, it's almost like a setup to Natalie Envy, that she might be this acoustical being, but she's not. She physically appears on screen. But this is something that that at times certain musical cues can be used to denote the character, certain sounds, heck, even their voice. A example of this is the mother in Psycho. She's not alive. So you hear her, we don't see her, or when we do see her, we realize she's dead. So she is her voice is a way to connote this acoustometra, or this acoustical being. Some other sounds uh, that you can read about, and these are all things that I'll go into more detail when we start talking about sound effects in more detail. Mickey Mousing, so very close use of sound effects to, you know, and the visuals, they're very close. It's almost like cartoonish. Audio dissolves. These are things as you move from one sound to another, and also one image to another, which also goes along with sound and time. And so transition between scenes, and you're going to see that Edgar Wright has a very distinct way of transitioning from scene to scene. And sometimes sounds can also, you can have certain sounds that lead you into a scene or lead you out into a scene. And then we sometimes have sound matches, and we definitely have elements where we start to play with sync sound that is playing with the image, and then we have a sound that's more of a counterpoint where it's playing against the image. And a lot of times with the use of counterpoint in sound, this is a lot of times to be used as humor and a defamiliarization, but it's also can be used for commentary. Your book doesn't talk about that. So I guess I did kind of go into a lecture on the readings just by going through it, but one of the things that, as I mentioned, Liz Green wants to take this whole concept of sound design and the importance of the use of noise. And we're actually going to have examples of that. And also how it's not typical, but the importance of the either the sound editor or the person that's in charge of the sound design for the film, how typically they come on at the end of the film during post-production. But for Liz Green, she sees that if you bring on the sound designer earlier on, in this case, the use of David Lynch and Alan Spetz sound design for several of David Lynch's film, especially, you know, Blue Velvet, Eraserhead, The Elephant Man, and that sort of thing. The use of noise is important, and also in turn sound effects and also music itself, depending on, based on these definitions, are important, and they don't have to be beautiful. So basically, these are sometimes some of the difficulties in discussing sound and sound design, is how many of the traditional definitions of music, noise, sound, and silence are not good enough. All right, so I'm going to dive in and lead you through some of the clips for you to watch. So the first clip that we have is an overall overview of Edgar Wright's sound design. And this is a great essay. We already saw the clip from Baby Driver and how the whole scene was choreographed based on the song Bell Bottoms. So we already know that. And then also, since you've already watched that scene, and feel free to go back and rewatch that clip. But since you should already be familiar with that, as you're watching this, and when in this video essay, when they start talking about not only the importance of the song, but also the importance of the sounds of the cars in many of these sequences, and then also how you hear, especially when they're going into the parking garage, the underground parking garage, how you can still hear the elements of the garage. So you can hear the poles when they drive past it. And this is something that, again, you might be like, so? But it gives it a sense of authenticity, even though, and it also, again, moves the sound to the forefront and the importance of sound for Edgar Wright. So Edgar Wright definitely, finds sound and sound design extremely important for his films. In the clips, it features his Coronado trio of Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, and World's End, but also Scott Pilgrim and Baby Driver. I believe this video was done right after Baby Driver was done. It doesn't dive into his television work or anything that came out after. But the thing is that it does highlight some of the Scott Pilgrim elements of sound design in here as well. But the thing is that some of the takeaways from this is that as you watch Edgar Wright films, you'll notice that the sound design is what drives many of the edits in Edgar Wright films. So definitely, as you watch some of the quick montage sequences, pay attention to how the sound makes these elements more dramatic. Sound effects and the sound transitions between scenes are typically sounds that are more natural sounds, and they're used as wipes to go from one scene to the next, and it gives it's very natural. And so so that's a lot of fun. And then also the physicality of the actors are emphasized. How they move, a lot of times we hear how they move. So whether it's I swing my head, and I know I just moved everything, but I swing my head, and for the most part, in real life, I didn't get a swish, as I moved my head really fast. But in this, we're getting the swish, or, some other dramatic element to emphasize this type of movement. And then already mentioned, some of the characters are louder than others. And some of these characters are meant to interrupt, say, our main character, annoy. And other times, they are used, for dramatic effect. And in the case of Scott Pilgrim, you have Knives, who is young. She is, she has a lot of energy to her. She's learning things. And so she is, at times can be very loud, but also very quiet. So, so the physicality of the characters. And then his camera moves also use a lot of sound. So, so it's one of those things where, as you watch it, you've already watched Scott Pilgrim, but as you watch these clips, notice how these things are used, not only in Scott Pilgrim, but if you've watched any of his other films. But the key thing is that he brings the sound to the forefront. The sound design is extremely important in his films, and even the mundane, everyday, kind of normal sequences are heightened almost by action sound. And so definitely watch this clip on how Edgar Wright uses sound. So I encourage you to do that right now. Wasn't that fantastic? Didn't you enjoy that? Wasn't that great? The other thing that you'll notice is how the film utilizes video game logic and video game sounds. And there's lots of video game sounds in the film. And this film, again, Scott Pilgrim versus the World, is a love story about Scott trying to defeat the evil exes of the 7 evil exes of Ramona in order to win her heart and date her. And so we have this, and Scott and also young Neil are very familiar with video games and video game logic. So, so that's definitely plays into into what we see in the film. So you have a clip that's all about all the video game effects in Scott Pilgrim, and it compiles many of them, and also the corresponding examples in actual video games. The only thing that I find disappointing in this clip is the fact that we don't actually hear the actual video games. Yes, we hear Sex Bomb, awesome, but I would have liked to have heard some of the actual real game sounds in these clips. But watch this and how it reinforces the video game sounds that reinforce the video game logic and images within the film too. So the sounds and the image play with each other. But yeah, so watch this click. I guess this is time for you to one up. Doo-doo. Even though most of the film, it, has a sense of video game logic and a use of comic book logic. So a lot of times when we see someone hit someone, we hear, punch or bam. When music is playing, we have the words, of this, the song, or the sounds coming out. So a lot of times in the video or in the graphic novel or comic book logic, these all play in there. There's also, in addition to the video game logic, comic book logic, superheroes also come into play in this film. If you haven't noticed, several actors who become superheroes, or at least in superhero films, do appear. I'll talk about that more in a moment. But we have a moment that plays with the television sitcom. And so for this class, we're talking about the soundtrack and screen media, specifically focusing on film, television, and the video game. Another reason why I use this film, because we've got all this video game logic in there. We also have a little element of the sitcom. And so you have the short clip that is the Seinfeld reference in the film. So we get the use of the Seinfeld television show kind of baseline. We have the use of the laugh track, and so this whole scene utilizes sitcom logic, especially from a sonic sound design standpoint. So watch that clip, and it's not a scene about nothing. That was a Seinfeld reference. Okay. So getting into the nuts and bolts of, the film. Opening credits. And a lot of times you'll notice that many of the examples that I will pull from or will show you, a lot of times we start right at the beginning, and sometimes it's the credit sequence. And the opening sequence, the credit sequence, a lot of times tells you a lot of the logic of what the sound design is going to be and what you are to expect from the film. Right off the gate, we start off with Nigel. Why am I flaking on his name? Oh, this is terrible. It's the sound designer for the film, Nigel Goodrich. Okay, so yeah, I do have the soundtrack too. Well, this is the score. And yeah, I've got the Blu-ray and DVD. I've got the CD, and I do have the normal vinyl. And then I've got the 7 Evil X's limited edition picture disc vinyl. So there you go. Yeah, no, I'm not a nerd at all. I don't like this film at all. But the fact that I couldn't remember Nigel Godrich. Okay. So we start off with Nigel Godrich's take on the Universal Studios, Universal Pictures theme. Originally done by Jerry Goldsmith, by the way. That's probably why I screwed up on Godrich's name, because I was thinking Goldsmith, Godrich. There you go. So the Universal theme and logo is all done 8-bit. And so this basically tells you that, oh, is this a video game movie? Okay, it's not. The video game to Scott Pilgrim came out after the film, by the way. So we have the opening music and visuals telling you we're getting into a film that is going to have a video game logic. And that continues even with this opening sequence. As we're introduced to the characters, we start to hear some of these video game sounds. Visually, we have the comic book logic, which is also fine. But we also start to play with not only the dialogue and how the characters speak to one another, but the key thing is we start off with the first voice we hear is of the narrator. And the narrator, Bill Hader, he speaks through, he's sprinkled throughout the film, and he's an omniscient narrator. So the characters within the film are not aware of the narrator. The narrator is giving us additional information. And so he is bringing us into this world. And this is something that a lot of times you'll have the background in a video game where sometimes it's words on screen. And this even starts off with words on screen. Comic books, we give you a tiny little way of diving you into where the writer gives you a little information before we get into the screen, gives you a little direction, a narrator, even though it's a visual medium. And film uses voiceover a lot as well. So we've got Bill Hader giving us voiceover as we are entering into the strange land known as Toronto, Canada. And so we also have the use of the music. So video games are going to be important, and video game logic. The dialogue and the way that people talk are going to be important as you pay attention to how the characters talk. But also to the forefront is the music, and highlighting this type of indie rock, even in essence a little bit of garage rock, but this more independent alternative type of rock music that you will hear throughout the film, as were demonstrated at the very beginning with Sex Bob-omb. So to get you reacclimated to the scene, rewatch the opening credits right now. All right, so the awe of Knives Chow. Oh my gosh. And we also have a slight manipulation of that. And did you hear how the sounds of the instruments and a little bit of the feedback was there at the very end, when her reaction? And it's very deliberate. It's very important because she is the new fan, and she is the character that, she does a lot of changing in the film. She is the coolest, but it's one of those things where, I'm just going to say right now, Scott did her wrong. Scott should have never been dating her, but still, Scott did her wrong. And here, the next sequence is all about knives, and this is a great two scenes to look at, in the fact that it's a great use of doubling. A lot of times, directors and films and television will sometimes do things in twos. though a lot of times we like to, you know, the rule of threes. But this one, um, we have two montage sequences on two different dates that that Scott and Knives have. One is they're both interested in each other. They're both excited about each other. And we also have the great use of the transitions. So not only do we have the great sounds of the transitions, but the dialogue also goes along from one location to the next. So if you pay attention, we get their conversation, because the conversation, regardless of they're walking down the street, they're playing the video game, they're going, you know, they're outside of the pizza, I think. They're going into the Goodwill, they're going into the music shop. All of these things, you know, are playing. So we start with the video game and then we move on out. And then notice how we're going to go backwards when Scott starts losing interest in Knives. But we go to all the same places and we still have the dialogue moves. So it's still, they still link each location to the next. The sounds transition from one location to the next. It's very seamless in how we transition. And though this is a quieter montage than, say, Scott getting ready for the final fight with Gideon, this also shows, again, the cleverness of Edgar Wright and his sound design team. All right, so we have to have some music. Oh, wait. I guess you need to watch it. Sorry. So watch scene. All right. So yeah, Scott, you should have broken up with her right there, but you didn't. You didn't. But okay. So now, the Battle of the Bands. All right. So this is we have the great scene with Sex Bomb, but also we've got a lot of great fun sounds in this scene. So we do have Scott freaking out that that Knives and Ramona are going to find out more about one another, and that Scott is still dating both of them. Also, we have the freak out of Stephen Stills, who is the talent. And I wrote in there, in addition to this film having bands, the music is done by also actual indie and, you know, alternative music artists. So Beck actually wrote all the songs for Sex Bomb, and but Stephen Stills, you know, the Mark Webber, who plays Stephen Stills, actually sings. Metric, which is a Canadian synth pop band from Canada, you know, also did the music for Clash at Demon Head. But Brie Larson and the Adams actually sings on that. And then, you know, Crash and the Boys was Broken Social Scene, also a Canadian band. So, but also, in addition to that, talking about the music, so Stephen Stills is named after the one of the members of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. Though traditionally, it's a lot of times it's just Crosby, Stills, and Nash, but sometimes they have Young, and Young is Neil Young, and Young Neil is a play on that as well. And Neil Young is Canadian, in case you didn't know. So there's a lot of references to other bands, to, you know, music in general, throughout the film. They'll even be talking about bands and that sort of thing. And even Scott's wardrobe. He wears a Plum Tree shirt, and Plum Tree is a band. They have a song called Scott Pilgrim. His SP and his Zero shirt, though are reflective of what he, of what he's, would wear. There are references to Smashing Pumpkins, but you could also say SP is also Scott Pilgrim, and Zero, he's not quite an evil ex-boyfriend yet. He drinks Coke Zero. He isn't quite, he doesn't have a number yet as it pertains to Ramona. But getting to the Battle of the Bands. So we have, the physicality going on in the, going in there. You have the horror sequence. So the nightmare, and the music reflects the nightmare that Scott is experiencing as he sees the potential of Ramona and Knives talking. There's also the horror of Stephen Stills as he's freaking out because Crash and the boys are doing really well, and we have how loud Crash and the boys is, and we can't really hear Stephen as he's freaking out and yelling at Scott and Kim. Like, how can we go on after that? And then we have Sex Bomb actually perform, and then we have a little hint of the fight with the first evil ex, Matthew Patel, but we also have the first time that we hear Wallace scream, "Fight!" So that's yeah, I kind of love it. So watch Battle of the Bands and pay attention to the use of sound that's related to horror and nightmare, the actual band sounds that we have, Wallace and his heckling, and notice how we have a spatial relationship between where Wallace is and where the band is, and of course the beginning sounds of the fight between Scott and Matthew Patel. You could also listen to the sound of when Scott smacks Stephen Stills. So watch it. All right, so now we have Scott and his, maybe a little bit more of a worthy opponent, and how I mentioned how a lot of times we have the use of doubles. Well, that wasn't meant to be a pun in the fact that we've got hit in the sequence with Lucas Lee, played by Chris Evans, that he has all of his stunt doubles in there. But when we are first introduced to Lucas Lee, he comes out and we have the 8-bit version of the Universal theme playing. So a nice little callback to the beginning. Also, it also links him to the movie industry, and so yeah, it's a lot of fun. But this takes it to the next level in terms of the fight and what Scott has to go through in order to beat Lucas Lee. And so we have again this great example of the use of dialogue, sound effects, and music in the scene to not only create this fun but yet a little bit more believable fight sequence. We also have especially when you have the shots of Lucas Lee going, grinding the thingy going down the railing, how pay attention to how the sound is when we're focused on him and when we're far away with Wallace and Scott. And so this really, again, really emphasizes the callback to the opening logo, the connection of Lucas with the industry, and at the time he had already done the Fantastic Four movie. He hadn't been Captain America yet, so it's kind of funny that here's Captain America as a bad guy. So pay attention to the sound in the Lucas Lee versus Scott. All right. So, another thing, Lucas Lee as a character is also a take on Jason Lee. Oh my gosh. Like, why am I flaking on his name? Because Jason Lee was a skateboarder before he became an actor. Jason Lee, who appeared in several of the Kevin Smith's movies, and he did do rom-coms for a little bit. And he was in the TV show My Name is Earl. He hasn't actually done stuff in a long time, but it was a little bit of take on that. Though Jason Lee didn't really go into the action area. So I will say this scene right here, the base battle, and Todd the Vegan, I will just mention that when Thomas Jane, who is, the main guy in the vegan police, comes out, I laughed so hard in the theater when that happened, and I thought it was hysterical. And I believe I did it again when I saw Scott Pilgrim again in the theater not that long ago. They did it was supposed to be in 2020, they were supposed to do the 10-year, and instead they did it as the 11-year anniversary. Yeah. So I did get to see it again in the theater, and it was fun. And I laughed really loud in this. So, and this sequence, as I mentioned, is full of your superheroes, or soon to be superheroes. So you've got Todd, who plays Superman. I know you're like, what? Yeah, Brandon Roth was Superman. Yeah, look for it. It's not. He didn't do any sequels, unfortunately. Poor Brandon Roth. Mary Elizabeth Winstead in Birds of Prey. So that's Ramona. She's the Huntress. Brie Larson, who plays Envy Adams, is Captain Marvel. And Mr. Thomas Jane of the Vegan Police was featured in the comic book movie The Punisher. So the fact that we've got all of these actors who either have played or had gone on to play superheroes or in comic book movies, I think is a lot of fun. But this scene, again, plays with the use of dialogue. Is a lot of fun. We can tell how smart Todd is. We have how Envy talks. So notice how it's one of those things where this is how Envy talks, but notice how it slightly changes when Scott calls her Natalie. So she's got this image, and so she's got this type of speaking, and even good old Julie, and this kind of brings us to, at the end of the sequence, we have Envy doing the black box and noise, and so I'll get to that after you watch the clip. So watch the base battle. So it's Scott versus Todd the Vegan, and so again, pay attention to dialogue, the use of music and sound effects. It's a fantastic scene. It's a lot of fun, and it's got all these superheroes in it. You were a vegan, now be gone. Sorry, so silly. All right. So we have Julie, who's actually the one that's known for having a, let's just say, colorful vocabulary that normally involves dropping the F-bomb. And so in the end of the previous clip, you had Envy use the black box and noise, but Julie uses it. And this is one of those cases where we have, even going back to Liz Green and her and her definition of noise. I mean, these are actually, the noise that we have are a variety of different types of technical sounds. And yet, please make sure that you read over all the definitions that Liz Smith, talked about as it pertains to noise and that sort of thing. So you've got the original, 6 families of noise, like roars and whistling and whispers and screeching and beating on things, and voices. And then you've got the Oxford English Dictionary definition of noises: loud and unpleasant, loud sounds, irregular fluctuations, and speech-like sounds without actual words. But typically, though, when we think of a lot of times of noise, is usually interference. So this can be interference that we have on a telephone. This could be the scrambling of sound, that sort of thing. So we have a lot of these where we're not really having the traditional beep that's used when we bleep out people who swear. And it's not to say that this film doesn't feature any swearing. We've got some less than harsh swear words in here. We've got ass and shit. But the big old F-bomb, or variations of the F word, we have Julie say them, but she has the black box and we hear the various noise sounds. And so as you watch this clip, also notice how they mix it up. It's not the same beep, beep. It's a variety of different, sounds and, different types of noises. But one of the things that's very fascinating about this sequence is the fact that it is diegetic. The voice, the noise that you hear in the black box, Scott sees it. Scott hears it. He's like, how are you doing that with your mouth? So this is one of the fun times where something that would traditionally be non-diegetic, something just for us, in this case, to make the film, I think it's PG-13. What are you? You are PG-13. And in Canada, you are PG. In case you wanted to know, but PG-13. So in order to make it PG-13, we don't have the cussing, but we still have the jokes that are pertain to the use of someone that has a potty mouth. And again, it is something that is diegetic. The characters hear it and see it. And so a lot of these sounds, so I didn't go into great depth, but I do want you to make sure that you do talk about how are some of these sounds, as you're doing some of your analysis for your WDJ. Definitely, you can feel free to talk about if something is diegetic or non-diegetic, if something is off screen or on screen. I want you to use many of these terms that I have listed for you in that I've talked about and that you find in the chapters. Now, the final clip that I have for you, oh wait, I should probably have you watch the clip where Julie says, I should probably go. So watch it. Beep. Okay. All right. So the final thing I want to talk about is the actual people that are talking about the sound design and the importance of the sound design in Edgar Wright's Scott Pilgrim versus the World. And so we have Julian Slater. And Julian Slater has been the sound designer for several of Edgar Wright's films. He's considered the supervising sound editor, so he supervises the whole post. But like what Liz Green is talking about in her essay, how it's rare that sound design, or at least the working on the sound design, typically doesn't happen until post-production. As you'll hear, both Julian Slater and two of the other guys that worked under Julian, the sound re-recording mixer Chris Burton and the re-recording mixer Doug Cooper, they all talk about how sound is important, and how they even got some of the dialogue while it was coming in so they can work with it. And they even gave some of the sound effects so that that could be incorporated in how they deliver. The music was worked pretty early on, and so as you watch this documentary on the sound of Scott Pilgrim, they were able to have access to things that typically they would only have access to the very end. And since Edgar Wright is so sound forward for his films, it is important that sound designer is able to have all of his tools pretty early on. So this is a fantastic video for you to watch as it pertains to the various sound design and techniques that are used in the film. And it kind of reinforces what we've already talked about and what you've already seen. So watch this video now. All right, so I hope you enjoyed all of these additional clips as it pertains to Scott Pilgrim, and in the discussion of sound and the three basic elements of speech, sound effects, and music. Now, silence is something that is also important, though this film is pretty noisy in terms of there's a lot of sound there. There are times that things get more quiet, and silence is used to punctuate some of these elements in a more dramatic fashion. And also the use of noise as an element, and though it's not necessarily unpleasant, is it? In this case, it's used for humor. And also the importance of the sound design, and how the sound designer was definitely instrumental in working on the film very early on. Trying to call back to your articles, much like Liz Green is talking about. But again, this is something it's pretty uncommon, and that's why Edgar Wright's sound, the sound in his films, are extremely unique. And also the other elements like tempo and rhythm, diegetic, non-diegetic, all that fun stuff. So hopefully this will make it a little easier for you to work on your WDJ. Feel free to use these clips as examples or other clips. So yeah, you can rewatch the film on Netflix, and maybe you want to do the Roxy sequence that is mentioned in great detail because of how it utilizes the music and the dialogue and the sound effects in a way, and how they're mixed in a way that also goes along with the choreography and that sort of thing. I didn't even I didn't touch on the final sequences fighting Gideon. That might be something that you want to focus on. That's fine. But the idea is that I want you to discuss these basic elements and start to think about them in more detail. Week 3, we are going to be specifically just looking at the voice. So we'll be looking at the voiceover, dialogue, and that element of the soundtrack in more detail. And if you want to get a jump start, feel free to watch at least the first 2 episodes of Arrested Development on Netflix. So it's the first 2 episodes are what I'm going to be talking about in more detail, especially through the use of dialogue and, of course, the omniscient narrator, which is actually Ron Howard, the film director, or who played Opie on the Andy Griffith Show. So, or Richie Cunningham on Happy Days, however you want to think about Ron Howard. So, so that is it. So don't forget, you have your syllabus quiz that's due the end of the day on the 12th. It's called survey quiz. I'm sorry. And your WDJ is also due the end of day on the 12th as well. And I think that's it. I feel like I should go out. Do 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 do. All right, sorry. Do 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 do. All right, see you next time.